Today, we're talking to Ani Mohan about the future of software development in the age of large language models. We're going to spend the conversation peeling away the layers of his vision to bring software development to billions of people. As you'll see, realizing that vision requires rethinking almost everything we know about software development. And I found this conversation and his vision to be quite incredible and surprisingly uplifting. I hope you walk away with the same feeling. Let's start. So right now you're an applied AI product lead at Google Labs, right? And you're focused on how we can augment software development using AI and generative models. And what's your background? How did you even get to be in this position?
Yeah. I've been at Google for quite some time. I initially joined back in 2014 as a product manager, working on a couple different sort of large products, Chrome and Android. And did that for a couple years and had, great experiences, but have always had the itch to build new products, start my own business. Got a chance to do that in college. Didn't really go anywhere, but loved the whole startup journey. And so was very close to kind of leaving and going and raising VC and doing the whole, startup thing. When around that time, this was 2016, 2017, Google was starting a fund to invest in sort of new products that came out of former Google employees. It was called Area 120, essentially an incubator, sort of seed stage fund hybrid structure. Thought it was a really interesting opportunity to raise capital and resources to build something new. I figured, the VC and capital markets would always be there.
Yeah.
Hopefully, even in downturns, there's still VC. But this sort of unique corporate structure to new product development might not always be there. So thought it was really interesting opportunity to get funded. Initially worked on a product in the personal finance space for a year. Didn't go anywhere, but learned a ton about how to do something from 0 to 1. Really liked kind of the Area 120 funding environment, liked my team. And so we got funded a second time to build something in the gaming space. Our initial idea was inspired by an app called HQ Trivia. I don't know if you remember that or heard of it.
Yeah, that was like a real-time thing, right? This is like 2016,
That was
2017.
2017, late 2017,
Yeah,
early 2018. It was sort of a hybrid between a game show and a game.
yeah.
A very bizarre thing in
We
hindsight.
would tune in at like 8 p.m. or something,
Right,
right?
right. And that's
Yeah,
the part that I found to be most interesting about it is everyone would drop whatever it is they would do at the same time every day to go like play this game, which is just a new behavior. Like I would be walking around like the streets of San Francisco and see that happening, which was like crazy to me. And my co-founder, who's a good friend of mine, who's a big gamer, so HQ was kind of at the intersection of our interests. Anyway, we got funded to build something like HQ. Long story short, that idea didn't work. This is a recurring theme in building something new. I'm sure you're familiar with that. The first idea
yeah.
never works. Second idea never works. We iterated across a bunch of different products in casual gaming for 2 years until we ended up getting product market fit, building a gaming platform for emerging markets. So think countries like
Mm.
India, and Nigeria, and Latin America, places where people are coming online for the first time, have never really gamed before. We inadvertently had built a product for them because our games were all entirely on the web. It kind of
Mm.
reminded us of the flash era of gaming,
Yeah,
20 years ago in the West. Essentially bringing that experience to billions of people around the world who are new to the internet, who didn't live through the flash era.
yeah.
And so the product and the business was called Game Snacks. We made that pivot right before COVID started. COVID was huge for gaming, so it led to a considerable amount of growth for us. And then we ended up getting acquired back into Google.
Mm.
When was that? Early 2022 is when the deal closed. And so spent a year kind of like establishing Game Snacks as a proper kind of Google business, uh, starting to grow the team more, getting monetization up and running, kind of seeing it through to maturity. But in the back of my head, I had a great time with the team and doing all that transition, but I know that I love working on new products. And so I was kind of thinking about what's next.
Mm.
And in parallel, I was getting obsessed with sort of GPT-3 and generative AI and all those things ever since GPT-3 came out back in 2020, I believe. I was tinkering all sorts of stuff on the side, like so many other people last year. Uh, and then a role opened up kind of in our labs team at Google for me to sort of lead product for new generative AI initiatives that we're working on. So I'm still relatively new to that, maybe about 3 or 4 months in, but it's been awesome, especially kind of at this moment where the industry is.
Yeah, yeah, this is wild. So for Area 120, how does it work? They give you a money, they give you like funding because they believe in you as a person, or because there's already a specific idea? Like, are they frustrated when you pivot? Do they encourage pivoting? Like, what's the climate like?
Yeah, I mean, think about it as analogous to what the very early stage kind of VC fundraising ecosystem looks like. So, pre-seed, seed, Series A style fundraising. I'd say earlier stage, so think pre-seed, seed.
Yeah,
So, at the very earliest stage, the focus is mainly on, the team, as it tends to be, sort of in a pre-seed deal, and a little bit in the idea. Right? Hopefully, you're onto something that's actually valuable. But there's an expectation that your first idea is likely not the idea that's going to work. And ultimately, what you're investing in is the team and the team kind of market combination.
yeah, yeah,
And so they were open to pivoting and all that. We had awesome backers. But given that we were demonstrating progress, we didn't pivot randomly. Like there
yeah.
was a rationale behind the pivots. And so we were, each pivot was informed by something we had learned. So that there was a story around progress. But yeah, there was an openness to taking the time to get it right.
Okay, so now you're back at Google, and you've been sort of like spearheading this new kind of like generative AI IDE direction, and you've been at it for 4 months or so. We're not going to talk about what you guys are up to at Google. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you questions about that. But uh, as of the last 4 months, then you've been working at Google Labs. Is that or a particular kind of product line? And like, what is Google Labs? I mean, Google Labs was around some time ago, and then they kind of they also did a pivot or something. Like, what's going on with Google Labs?
Yeah, I mean, you can actually check out the URL for yourself at let me just confirm it, labs.google.com. It was announced at Google I/O a few weeks ago.
Yeah, recent.
It's essentially a place for a bunch of Googlers to work on new product development
Mm,
in generative AI. I think
mm,
Google's obviously a big player in the space. And it's transforming a lot of our core products. Generative AI is. I mean, it's true not just at Google; it's true for many companies, across the industry. Probably every company in the world will be
yeah.
transformed by generative AI. But kind of the charter of our team is to think less about how we change existing products and more about how we invent new products.
Mm,
It's important for larger companies like Google to have structured efforts to be doing innovation for new kind of technology trends. So I
yeah.
can't go into more detail than that,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that's
yeah.
the charter.
That's an awesome charter. Okay, so how do you even begin thinking about kind of like the future of software with respect to generative AI? So, like, maybe one way we could, because I know practically nothing about this space, perhaps one way we can just sort of like organize it for the audience is maybe we can go a little bit more deeply into how the models that are powering whatever thing we're going to be striving for are built in the first place and trained. Like, or so for example, like I started, if I'm using ChatGPT, I can just ask it to write some code. It knows how to write code, right? um, are you guys just sitting on top of ChatGPT? And if not, why not?
Yeah, and so again, I'm not going to go into anything specifically at Google, but just kind of
Yeah,
this is me, and also I'm not a machine learning engineer,
yeah,
so a lot of this is just me working in the space for the last 4 months, but reading a ton about it, talking to a bunch of people about it, and trying to think about it from first principles.
yeah.
Um, in terms of the models themselves, yeah, I mean, you can get into it, and specifically kind of what they do around output and code. You mentioned it, right? You see examples on Twitter of people typing in things like, I want to build XYZ. I want to build an app to, recommend movies for me to watch with my friends. I've seen that like 5 times. And it just literally gets the code, like output it. It might have bugs at first, but what people often do is they like copy and paste that code into an IDE, they run it. There's some error message inevitably that pops up, but then they just copy and paste that error message back into ChatGPT or Bard, or
Yeah.
whatever other LLM you're using, and boom, rinse and repeat a few times, and you kind of have something that's working. Is that like production ready software? No, probably not. But it's a usable prototype or a usable app. Maybe taking a step back, it's interesting. I think like there's two ways that these code models are seemingly roughly being used right now.
Mm.
Uh, One is by existing engineers, right? And you see this with tools like GitHub Copilot and tools that Google announced, again at I/O, that are mainly targeted towards existing software engineers and integrating LLMs and the code generated by the LLMs into existing sort of software engineering workflows. Um, I think almost nobody in the world thinks this isn't going to be a really transformative thing to the software development process because it makes the process of writing software engineering or writing software just more efficient. People can produce the same amount of software, sometimes even higher quality software. It's already the same people who are used to making software. They do it a lot faster, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of a no-brainer productivity unlock for the
Yeah.
software economy. Still TBD how that's going to play out, but that's going to play out. But I think in parallel, there is a much more nascent, but in my opinion, even more interesting phenomenon happening of non-engineers, like i.e.
Mm.
people who do not identify as software engineers, who maybe have never written like code seriously before, or maybe they've taken a CS class, or I think it's hard to. We're still trying to figure out who exactly are these people. Are they people who've
Yeah.
literally never opened a terminal before? Have they done it once, like 10 years ago? But point is, they're not professional software engineers, and they're making software. Like that's insane, right? They're
Yeah.
making
Yeah.
software without actually really knowing how to code in the traditional sense. I mean, maybe you can say prompting is the new coding. Some people think that it's not quite that simple, but eh, they're not coding in the traditional sense. And I think that's a really mind blowing thing, honestly, because making software is like really hard, and it's traditionally been viewed as a really really like rare skill. I'm not diminishing that. I mean, obviously, it's still hard to make high quality software, but the fact that it's becoming more accessible to a new category of people is super, super interesting to me. And I'm very excited to see how that'll play out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting because like I know that some of the hardest things about getting started with programming is even just getting your environment right.
Totally.
And oftentimes you need somebody to help kind of like push you along because you can't just very easily start coding on your computer, right? Like you need to kind of arrange the pieces in a certain way. And that's true if you start with a new programming language, right? Anytime you need to like modify your environment. And very recently I've started asking ChatGPT to kind of just help me get started with a whole new language, right? And it's incredible just how quickly I can get my computer to set up properly, right? Like this is just like the biggest hurdle. It's like, okay, what are the 10 steps that I need to go through? You just walk me through one by one. And I've never been faster than I am now, right? Like it's been insane, let alone like my actual kind of like software development practice, which I can get into. I mean, like I've been now using ChatGPT as like, I can't not use it. It's so incredible. In
Critical
fact,
part of your workflow. Yeah.
100%. And like so much so that a couple of months ago, I was considering whether I should continue writing code at all, or whether I should just, like only review code, or just kind of like in my career, maybe like I should sort of like stop it. But then I came across ChatGPT and its impact on my workflow, and I realized that I can't stop now. Now is the time to double down and see just how much leverage I can get. Right. So, okay. So you're interested both in, well, it sounds like you're more interested in those people that are now starting to get into software development. They might not identify as engineers. And then you also have engineers. So I suppose that their workflows will diverge a little bit because the expectations and desires of existing engineers are not going to be ones of the new folks, because the new folks are coming at it fresh, right? They're not bringing in all of the bias.
That's right. That's
Mm.
right. And so kind of to piggyback off of that, I think there's an opportunity to sort of think from first principles and like a blank slate. What should software development look like, in a world where generative AI exists? And it's a massive design problem, because I think really when you go down that rabbit hole, you need to reimagine the entire end-to-end development workflow from when you get the idea for what you want to build to like having a URL that other people can visit. There's a lot of steps, that are
Yeah.
involved to go through that whole process. Why not rethink all of it? It's a big question. It's going to take time. I think it's not really under the purview of only one company. I think the whole
Yeah.
industry needs to figure that out. But I don't know. I think it's exciting.
Yeah, yeah, that's very cool. Yeah, it sounds like unless you add some more constraints, it's just be impossible to make progress. I mean, like
That's
this
right.
is
That's right. That's
this is
right.
crazy.
That's right.
Uh, when you think about what is currently even possible, given generative models, because those might provide the kind of constraints that are useful. Not everything is possible, right? Like, so what do generative models currently do for us?
Yeah, it's a good
Yeah,
question. And I'm just trying to find a couple resources that might help for that. I mean, there's the like Palm 2 technical report, and the GPT-4 technical report, kind of put out by Google and OpenAI respectively, that go into this a little bit. That,
yeah,
at least from what I've seen, is the best like capabilities teardowns out there from the actual model authors.
yeah.
And there's sections specifically on coding, and there's things that it can do well and can't do well, and all that. But
This is it, right?
maybe,
You're,
yeah, that's it.
yeah.
Uh, and maybe this is, yeah. And see, you can see there's an evaluation. Coding was under one of the sections under evaluation,
Oh,
and so
yeah,
that probably goes into more detail. I should probably go through and read this again. It's been a little
yeah,
bit. But what's interesting is that, I don't think anyone in the world actually has a proper, full, objective analysis of this.
yeah,
Like, we have intuitions, but I mean, code is just a special case of language, right? And as we've seen with all LLM applications,
hmm.
no one has a holistic understanding of exactly what it can and can't do right now.
Yeah, yeah. Wait, this is Palm 2. You said there was also the Chat GPT, the GPT-4
That's right.
technical
There's
report. Yeah,
there's an analogous version of this, right, for GPT-4.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see this here. All right, folks can go through this. So we don't really know, but yeah, I guess this is so perhaps we can't really use this as constraints. Well, but we do know what engineers are currently using it for. So what are
Correct.
engineers currently using this for?
Correct. Oh, you're trying to. Yeah, this is tied to the constraints question. Um,
Yeah.
what are engineers currently using it for? Uh, I mean, if we look at the stuff that we see on Twitter, I can't go into private data or anything like that from Google, but I mean, a lot of it is, I see all sorts of things, right? It's from anything from fixing one-off bugs to writing functions. Like, one of my favorite kind of use cases that I see is, you put into your IDE a comment description of the function that you want, and then you hit autocomplete and it just writes the function. Like, that's insane.
Yeah.
There's no reason to really think about how to do that. Two, I mean, even like the full-fledged app structure, I think there's a little
Mm.
bit less of that with professional engineers. And it's
Yep.
interesting because, like, I mean, this product and this category that I'm working on is interesting for a bunch of reasons for me. One, just because I think the opportunity to reinvent the entire software industry and how software is made is just a very exciting one to anyone who works in technology. Software runs the entire industry, right? So that's one part. The other part is, I mean, this is probably the first thing that I've ever built, and I've built a lot of things where I'm the target user. I'm not a professional
Mm.
software engineer. I'm technically competent. I can build things. I can prototype, but I'm not. I've never been a professional software engineer. I can, and I always need help when
Mm.
I'm building stuff. And so, uh, I have an intuition for what the target user might want for this, because it's me. I'll use this every day, all the time. So that's actually why I'm probably not as well equipped to speak about what professional software engineers are doing, because I'm not
Yeah.
one. I'm limited by just what I see online. But I can tell you what non-engineers probably want to make from this.
Yeah, I can tell you what, like, as I was reflecting on like the kinds of
Yeah,
things
what
I
do
would
you use
want
it
it to
for?
do.
Yeah, what do you use it for? Or
Yeah,
how do you use it right now? You said you use it all the time.
all the time. So, Actually, I made a little list of all the things that I, just the verbs
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah, yeah. You
you
should be
know.
able to, not me.
I say this. Okay. So the most interesting thing for me, for sure, is design questions. So this is kind of like when I try to use a whole new paradigm, or let's say I'm trying to use like a whole new thing with AWS, right? The other day I was like, okay, I'm converting from like one way of doing the data engineering to another way. So let's say now I'm like trying to use it for AWS Glue, and I want Glue to be running whatever these like Dockerized images as jobs, and I want the workflow to be orchestrated in this way and not in that way, and I want the lambdas to be interacting with the database to keep track of the metadata. Like I have this whole kind of like picture in mind, and I want to know what the proper file structure might be given the kinds of constraints that I'm introducing. Because just give me the file structure and I'll figure out the rest. Like I want to have like a blueprint, right? And I ask it, just can you give me the file structure? And it's incredible, right? It just gives me, he's like, this is it. This is how you should do it. This is where the shared code should go. This is where the services need to be. It's not perfect at it, right? But it gets me very close. And it saves me. I mean, I don't even know where I would have begun to search for these sorts of answers in the past. Like it doesn't exist, right? Most people will, if you go on Stack Overflow, they're not going to tell you anything like this, right? This is way too qualitative. It's way too open-ended. But for some reason, like the generative models are totally comfortable in that open space, and they'll nevertheless give me some suggestion. So once they give me that kind of high level, just like structure, this is where all the files are. Now I go deeper into each one of it. Okay, but what about this? What about this? What about this? How should I export this? How should I expose this? And it just keeps kind of, all I'm asking for is, in the beginning, it's just high level stuff. And then gradually I just kind of like spiral in to actual code implementation. And very often things break along the way, right? So then just 2 days ago, I was stuck on a problem for maybe like an hour and a half. And I asked ChatGPT what the problem was, and it didn't, it sort of knew. It didn't give it to me. It didn't give me the solution exactly, but it gave me a clue, and within 5 minutes I figured it out, right? Now I've also been led astray, so and that happened quite a few times too, where
Sure.
like it told me to do something and it was complicated and it was overkill, and I couldn't trust it. And
Sure.
right now what happens is like when I ask it something that is quite specific and that is like library specific, it'll give me an answer, and then I always have to follow it by saying, are you sure? And then to see whether it doubles down or apologizes, because I've seen that maybe like 50% of the time it'll immediately apologize because it's not up to date or something like that. So I don't even test what it told me. I get the result and I immediately type, are you sure? To see whether or not it's going to stick to it. So I haven't yet used it for explaining code. I've seen people use it for explaining code. I haven't used it for commenting my existing code because my code tends to be well commented. Although I imagine that like I have some questions for you about how to even think about the future of commenting, because that feels like a rabbit hole. So certainly debugging. I haven't used it for translating yet, like from
Yeah.
from let's say like
Sure.
from TypeScript to Python. But I imagine that
Translating
a lot of people.
is it's one of the coolest use cases I've seen. And sort of a related one is people when they need to build something for the first time in a language that they're not familiar with, learning about that language through ChatGPT.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Yeah, so for me, it has mostly been just kind of like consulting for sort of like high level software decision, and but also like finding slightly better ways to do things that I currently do, and then
Mm.
feeling really good in the process. Because I feel like, man, did I just become the 10x engineer just like
Sure.
overnight? I don't know, right?
Yeah.
Like
I mean, yeah, that you probably did, right? You probably did.
it,
Um,
it's testing is the other one that I'm very curious about, and I've seen some people starting to talk about, but I haven't used it to like write unit tests or that sort of thing, or
okay.
integration tests. Um, yeah. Anyway, that's sort of. But so I have a question for all of these different things. Right now, I'm still using the same model, right? Just ChatGPT. Oh, and right now I started downloading these like plugins on my IDE, and they might not be using ChatGPT. But do you have an intuition about the kind of model that has to work under the hood, and how they go about, and like why ChatGPT might be insufficient for all of these tasks that we just described?
Yeah, I mean, related to that, the former CTO of GitHub, his name is, I believe, Jason Warner, just announced a couple weeks ago that he works in VC now. He just announced that he's leaving VC to start a foundation model company, specifically to train a coding foundation model.
Wow.
And maybe you should link to this or something. It's called Poolside. It's interesting reading their announcement because I think it goes into a little bit his, someone who's obviously had an incredible vantage point working on developer tools for so many years. His sort of point of view of how getting code models right is potentially the unlock to AGI. There's clearly something
Mm.
special. Sort of another interesting kind of tidbit, relatedly, that maybe gives us some intuition for the models, is when you take an LLM that's trained on a bunch of stuff that's non-code based, so just text, and add coding to or add code to its training data. It turns out it not only obviously performs well on coding related tasks then compared to previously when it wasn't trained on code, it also performs better on non-coding related language tasks, which is bizarre. And
Yeah.
nobody has an amazing theory why. The best that I've heard is code is arguably like the most structured like language that we have out there. You know,
Mm.
it's it's not easy to write code, but it's much more logical than like English, for example, in many
Yeah.
ways. And so there's some inherent underlying structure in code that is clearly generalizable to other parts of how we communicate, which is super interesting, right? And I don't know how much like academic research has been done on that. I don't know if the like English professors were talking to the CS professors before, uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but there's something around that, which I still find to be fascinating. I feel like better understanding that probably does give you an intuition for these models. I haven't trained a coding model, so I can't give you an incredible answer to how they work. But a lot
Yeah.
of it is using the sort of techniques that are used for training general LLMs, but fine tuning it on code. I'm leaving a lot of details out. Obviously, a lot of engineers are going to be mad at that description. But a lot of the heavy lifting is being done by the LLM that was trained on sort of the general text corpus.
Yeah. Yeah. So got it. It's still that like the foundation will just still be language, but then you go and you fine tune it. And but it's interesting because like so much of what it's been trained on has already been code, right? Like even if you think about like ChatGPT, GPT-4, right, it's already sort of vacuumed up all of the instances of code that it found online.
Well, not all of it. I mean, I'm sure they had to deal with like licensing issues and all that.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question, right? Of like, what does this data set of code look like? Some of it is public under open
Yeah.
licenses, some of it is not. Most of the code in the world is not public, right? It's sitting inside of company servers. And so I think there's an interesting question of what does that look like? How do we unlock that data for training model purposes?
Okay, so now let's imagine we have those. Are there just like the existing? Who are like the superstar models out there for code? Is there something that you know, sort of like off the back of your hand, like
Like, you mean something that's only for code, like not
yeah, or like optimized for code?
optimized for code? I mean, there's Codex, from OpenAI. I know the internal names that we use for the Google model. I forgot
Oh,
what the externally
Google.
announced name is.
Yeah.
I can look it up for you if you want. It was just announced at I/O.
So OpenAI has one that's Codex, and then Google has one,
Cody. Cody is what we call the
Cody.
external version of it. Right. Sorry, I know all the internal names.
Yeah,
Naming.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Okay, cool.
right. Right.
Any other big famous ones that people should keep in mind, or is those are kind of like the
I haven't actually played around with Claude yet from Anthropic.
mm,
I want to. I don't know how good Claude is at coding. I'd be surprised if it couldn't do it at all.
yeah.
Let me see. I should know this. Yeah, it can do coding. And then, I mean,
Okay.
there's also the open source models, right? Like the llamas of the world. Have you messed around with those? Do you know? How
Yeah,
good they
yeah.
are at writing code?
Yeah, but not for code. I haven't tried them for code.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, I've been, it depends on the day. Sometimes I'm like more impressed and sometimes less with the open source versions. Although I imagine that they'll just become kind of like they'll just be the foundation for further tuning, right? By folks who do have access to more code, and
That's right.
perhaps they can specialize more interestingly. Yeah.
That's right.
So, and then ultimately be cheaper to run or so, I imagine. Like it's right, like
That's
many
right.
of the a lot of the work that's been done, it's just you could now start running these things on your computer. I think like I ran one of the open source ones on my computer and it was uh it was incredible. It's just like now I don't have to pay for this, right? Like even for
Well,
okay, so now let's talk about like the tools out there. Are you familiar with like some of the existing tools? So like I've used Copilot, right? Even that's like you have to pay for. Um, how do people actually use any of these things right now? I mean, like short of people going and opening a tab and chat GPT and like typing their questions, how do they interact with this sort of intelligence?
yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. And again, I think the answer varies depending on who you are, right? Are you an existing developer versus are you not? And this is where I think, I mean, and it's kind of a subset of a broader question I think that's raging in the industry now, which is like, who benefits from generative AI? Is it startups, is it incumbents? Like, how much is it about
Hmm.
the new product? How much is it about distribution? Frankly, we'll have to see how it'll play out.
Hmm.
Everyone's going to win, but hard to figure out the relative sizes of the winnings. Um, from what I've observed, when it comes to like starting with existing software, and you keep me honest, you're the software engineer amongst us. A lot of it is bringing the stuff into the IDE, right? Because engineers have workflows that they've spent like a decade plus developing, so it's
Yeah.
very hard to get them to like go elsewhere to write code. But funnily enough, I do hear many times engineers using like Bard and ChatGPT to go and write stuff, which I find
Hmm.
fascinating because I would have thought that would have taken you out of your existing workflow. But many of the tools I've seen are like VS Code plugins,
Hmm.
or other things that, or like I've seen all sorts of like next generation terminals popping up,
Yeah.
things like iTerm or whatever, but with Gen AI at a core. So there's a lot of like IDE plugins, I would say.
Yeah.
Uh, I think some of the hosting providers are going to start doing interesting stuff too. Like one thing that comes to mind is like Replit.
Yeah.
Uh, Replit's interesting because it sort of bridges many of these together. Is it an IDE? Is it a hosting provider? It's a unique type of product, I think. But they have like Ghostwriter, right, which is their AI code generation feature. Um,
So for
so
people who
that
are not familiar, Ghostwriter is like it's like a chat. It's a little dialogue. I could pull it up um, because I think I've seen somebody was telling me that they're using in their IDE they have a chat interface, and maybe it was in VS Code. It was like some plugin or something. I don't know, but I couldn't find that in WebStorm. But when I was playing around with Replit the other day, they did. Oh yeah, here we go. I'll share my screen. Yep, Ghostwriter here. Like that's the thing on the side. And I can ask it some questions, and I have like 5 remaining. I think yeah, they were advertising for it in the beginning. Yeah. Have you seen? I haven't seen this in other inside IDEs, but I did hear about it. And other people also told me that they've they highlight something in their IDE. I think it might be also like a VS Code plugin. They highlight something in their IDE, and then immediately there's like a chat component that tells them what the thing does. Right, just kind of like explains this,
hmm, cool,
which I thought
interesting,
was interesting. Yeah,
interesting.
I thought that probably made sense for like bigger companies that might where like you're not familiar with the code base.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So yeah, I mean, these are some for I think existing software engineers, but then for new engineers, I mean, again, this just speaks to where we are in the industry. These products don't exist yet, right? Like it wasn't possible for this behaviors to even be happening, like until ChatGPT and Bard were launched, which happened what like 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So I don't think that many people yet are even focused on that market. Like so much of the
Mhm.
focus right now is on serving the existing software engineers. So maybe I'm sure there's maybe folks in your audience will know like examples of very small products that were launched, over the last few months, and I'm sure they exist. People are starting to catch on, but still so early. And I think
Yeah.
that one's going to take a long time to play out.
Yeah. Do you have an intuition that you're willing to share about who you imagine might be an early adopter of code coming from a non-technical background?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, Trying to develop an intuition, frankly,
Yeah.
and this is part of my job. Um, I think one is so. I mean, if you look at like the universe of like people online, there's like 3 billion people online, so give or take somewhere between 7 to 8 billion people on the planet.
Yeah.
Call it half the world online. Let's just say.
Yeah.
Of that, only 25 million people are software engineers. So that leaves what 2.85 billion people who are not software engineers.
Yeah.
Is my math right? I think it's right. I might even be off there. Uh, Something like that, right? Close
Yeah.
to 3 billion people who are not software engineers. That's insane. Who are online. Close to 3
Yeah.
billion people who are not software engineers who are online. That's the addressable market, I think. That's way too big of a number, right, to start with from day one, as you pointed
Sure.
out. You got to start with constraints. And so it's a pretty big spectrum between someone who's like literally just got a phone for the first time last week in an emerging market to
Yeah.
a high skilled knowledge worker who's been using the internet every day for the last 20 years, but is still not an engineer,
Yeah.
many people in the Western world who work white collar jobs. And so I suspect, um, but there's a flip side to that. The flip side of that is, and we see this with other industries as well, many early adopters to consumer products these days tend to be people in emerging markets
Hmm.
because they have less preconceived notions about how the world should work, right? They're starting
Yeah. Yeah.
with plus their only portal to the internet is a phone. They don't even have a laptop. So, like for example, I'd be very curious how
Hmm.
many Replit user breakdown uh, between mobile and desktop, and I'd be curious to figure out of their mobile users what percentage of them are in other countries, like outside of the U.S.,
Yeah.
the Western world. So anyway, these are a few thoughts. To make it concrete, I think I would expect people from emerging markets to be among the first set of adopters for this, for the reason that I shared, that they don't really have pre-existing workflows as much, and they're just newer to the internet, so they haven't had time to develop workflows. And I would also think people who are not engineers, but like are adjacent to the engineering function, let's say.
Right.
People like me, right? Like I'm a product manager. I learned to code. I can code, but I'm not a professional engineer. Like I'm probably more likely to. I mean, I am a user of this already, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So more people like me.
Yeah, yeah, that was my intuition too. It's just like folks that are sort of like adjacent. Like you get these perhaps like scientists trying to now deploy some of the things that they've kind of
Totally,
toyed
totally,
around with.
totally. Or like data scientists who are used to working in like Jupyter Notebook or like
Mm.
Google Colab, but
Yeah.
haven't quite use React or like Flutter to build an app, like that kind of thing. Yeah, but it'll be interesting to see.
Mobile first programming, that even that sounds like a completely new paradigm shift. Like is it because as I see programming right now, it will be impossible to do it on a phone, right? But I'm not seeing what programming could become, right?
That's
Like
right.
the
That's right. And I think that's the interesting question, right? Is like, yeah, it's very hard to conceive of what programming on your phone looks like today. But that's because we're thinking about it in terms of like you having to type every single key, right, in every line
yeah.
of code. We had the opportunity to reimagine it, and we've seen what happens in other uh, sort of parts of the internet economy when creating stuff that was previously hard becomes super easy all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Uh, like for example, we saw this with photography, right? Like the shift to the mobile phone and the camera on the phone. Boom, like Instagram happened. Turned everyone into a professional photographer.
Yeah.
We saw this with videos, right? Like YouTube happened, TikTok happened. Like everyone's like a video star and like a
Yeah.
professional, like camera person.
Yeah.
Why can't we see the same thing with code? And if that's true, right? Maybe it'll take a while to play out. It's hard to see what the path looks like, but I don't see why that won't happen at this point. With generative AI. Then, like, what does the whole software like industry look like, right? If you have 2 billion, 3 billion people, or maybe at that point there'll be 5 billion people online, 5 billion
Yeah.
people writing code. It sounds like a crazy question, but that would have been a crazy question to ask about video 10 years ago too.
Do you think there is enough code to be written?
Say more. What's
So
underlying
like
that?
let's imagine like if you have you could always at some point we will have run out, like I can't really conceive of a point at which we'll run out of entertainment, right? So like there's always more movies, always more videos, always more songs. People will always keep engaging and enjoying, and they'll get tired of their own. But could it does software have like a natural capacity where we say, okay, well now we're done. There's nothing else that like if you have 4 or 5 billion, like this is what 1,000x the number of developers. Is there enough code for all of them to actually start writing? Or at some point we will have run out. And if we do run out, I mean, perhaps that's a very good thing, right? Like perhaps we won't be able to get to that limit unless we get the next few billion people starting to write code.
I think that the thing about human beings is like our desires are kind of infinite. You know, our eyes are bigger than our stomachs, and you see this, you know, across any kind of resource. Like we always find when it becomes cheaper, like we'll find new ways to use more of it, you know, and some new thing will become scarce. Like code is just like a manifestation of like the human imagination, right? Like you ultimately code is all abstract.
Hmm.
Why do we write anything? It's just because like someone had an idea to make something, and I don't think we're ever going to run out of that, right? As long as humans are around.
Do you think that there are certain like essential components of software development that are unlikely to be offloaded onto generative models that still require the kind of human cultivation that
Yeah,
might become still scarce or undesirable by people to adopt?
yeah, that's a really good question, and I wish I had an amazing answer to that. It would be nice to know the answer to that. I mean, you mentioned one thing that was interesting when you were talking about how you use it, which is like as part of like the planning process. Like planning is like or like the design process, right? Is the thing what you
Yeah,
said?
yeah.
Setting up the architecture or whatever. That's a higher level skill as an engineer than just actually like implementing a function. And the way it's reflected in organizations is often more senior engineers are doing that compared to junior engineers.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, AI is starting to do it, which is interesting. And maybe as you know, future models come out, it'll do that even better and better and better. But I would say things like in that domain at this point feel difficult and scarce and unlikely to be done by AI. Like deciding what to build in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Um, and even planning, right? I'm sure you didn't completely delegate the design or designing. You didn't delegate
Yeah.
the design completely to AI, like you were involved, just helped you. But I think those types of higher level tasks, um, I think are going to take longer.
Yeah, there's something that I felt after like the first maybe 2 or 3 years of going like of just like writing code all day, that I realized that I was taking things very literally. And I think this is I think my mind is already kind of like prone to taking things very literally. Um, and I found it increasingly difficult to just be living in like the ambiguity of just the gray area, right? Like I remember my ex-girlfriend she'd ask me like, can you pass the cup? Yeah, of course I can. Oh, you want the cup? Oh, I didn't. It took me an extra few steps to recognize that she also wanted it. She didn't just ask whether I could, right? But when you are programming all day long, this is very clear. This is the expected behavior, right? The expected behavior is a yes or no. Um, I wonder whether that will persist. Like whether like getting more people to start writing code, does that still mean that they have to reason in an extremely meticulous, oftentimes sort of like um, still algorithmic kind of way, and whether those tools will simply help to augment the algorithmicizing of their thinking, or whether we will be able to contend with living in that purely vague and ambiguous space and just perhaps pulling out intuitions and desires more clearly.
Yeah. Well, how do I mean? No, just turn that question back to you. Like, how do you feel using ChatGPT and these tools right now? Like, do you feel like you're spending a smaller fraction of your time in like the logic space of your brain compared to the like intuition space.
I feel like the logic has just shifted away from the programming and into the prompting.
Into the prompting, fair. Prompting is still a lot. Yeah, this is the first time I've kind of like heard it described in this way, but I think it's super interesting. Like, is prompting an intuition driven exercise now, or is it a logic driven exercise? It's kind of fascinating. And I
Yeah.
think the answer varies depending on who you are, right? Because like you can just type in intuition stuff, but clearly people who prompt more like have found all sorts of interesting unlocks with using logic too. I don't know what that means. I don't have a good
Yeah,
take on.
yeah, I guess it could just we could just like lean into the iterative nature of the prompting. And so,
Yeah,
you know,
right,
yeah.
right, right. And I mean, this is true even in other like just think about conversation, right? That you're having between like two people. Like, are you using the logic part of your brain in that conversation? Intuitive. It depends on what you're talking about, right? And like who
Yeah.
you're with. So I don't know if like I don't know if that's actually like going to change because of AI, I guess so to speak. Maybe the way to think about AI is that it doesn't reallocate the percentage of time in your head between intuition and logic because
Mm.
that's just stuff that's happening in your head. It's more about just reallocating the tasks, and it frees you up to do other tasks that maybe are still logic driven, but are for whatever reason harder for the AI to
Yeah,
do.
yeah. Yeah, I could see that. Like it's I saw this meme on LinkedIn the other day. It was like software developers like, don't worry, AI is not going to replace you. At least it won't until or before clients are able to clearly articulate what they want. Right.
Right. And that's that who knows if that'll ever be solved. 'Cause people
But
don't know
that
what they
can
want.
get us that can get us much closer though, right?
You
So
get
like that guide could just be a like a therapist, or just like more of like a perhaps an archaeologist, just like excavating our desires deeper and deeper until it finds that thing that we actually want to do, although we never knew that that's the thing we wanted to do until we
That's
were
right.
asked and prompted.
That's right. That's right. The other thing too is what was I going to say? Yeah, you were asking other things that might be rare for a rare skill and something that engineers will still need to do. I mean, this one's sort of tied to the size of the context window, but it's going to take
Mm,
time for the context window to like go to infinity. I think the largest one out there right now is Claude's with 100,000
yeah,
tokens,
yeah,
which is large, but I mean, like many code bases are like way bigger. And as you probably know, one of the hardest parts of engineering is like working across multiple code bases and all that. So maybe there's more time being spent around like playing that stitching role.
yeah, yeah, definitely. That's one of the things that I have to do now. It's like because I have so many different things on like different files, and I have to copy and paste them all into like one place so that I can feed it into the ChatGPT and ask it the question.
Yeah. This is making me want to see, I guess, essentially a hierarchy of tasks of complexity for software engineering. Right. With the simplest
Yeah,
one being like fix this bug, to the most complex one being run run the engineering organization for this company.
yeah. Be the chat CTO or something.
Right.
For people who are interested learning more either about you and what you do or just sort of like this space in general, are there any recommendations you might give?
Well, plug myself first, I guess. So you can follow me on Twitter. It's where I'm most active. Ani underscore C underscore Mohan. I've had like a personal website for a while where I've done some writings. I'm trying to write a lot more using my favorite LLM helper to help me out. And a lot of the stuff I think about is this space. So that's one. I think other resources. So I wanted to share this earlier, but probably the single resource that best shaped my entire thinking on this space. I can ping it out to you.
Yeah,
An amazing article from SK Ventures back in March 2023. So I guess like 3 months ago.
yeah,
Called "Society's Technical Debt and Software's Gutenberg Moment." Um, which I think just does a much more succinct job of explaining a lot of things that we talked about here. Really, really good sort of vision of what might happen.
yeah,
Um, Otherwise, I mean, Twitter, follow
yeah.
all the people working on code stuff. I think that's still the best resource.
Thank you. I'm gonna share this in the show notes below. Ani, thank you so much for your time today, and best of luck. This is a very inspiring vision that you guys
Cool.
have.
Thank you. Thanks for being down to chat.
Yeah, of course. Good luck.
Cool.